Welcome back. In our last session, we looked at the beginning of the Passion narrative in John's Gospel. In particular, we examined the arrest scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Jewish trial scene, the denial of Peter, and the Roman trial scene, or the trial before Pilate, which contains the Barabbas scene. In our current session, we shall complete the Passion narrative of John and begin our discussion of the resurrection narratives. In particular, we shall examine Jesus bearing his cross to Calvary, what has come to be known as the Via Dolorosa, the death scene, and the burial. Then we shall jump to the first Easter Sunday and examine the discovery of Peter and the beloved disciple at the empty tomb, the appearance of Jesus to Mary Magdalene, concluding with the appearance of the risen Lord to the disciples gathered in the upper room that first Easter evening. Once Pilate had issued the order for Jesus' execution, the process moves quickly in John's Gospel. The soldiers take Jesus, placing the crossbeam on his shoulders, and walk him to the site of crucifixion, known as the place of the skull, in Hebrew, Golgotha. In typical Johannine style, Jesus bears his own cross. Remember, in the Good Shepherd narrative, he said, "I lay down my life. No one takes it from me." Thus, there is no need of assistance for Jesus in his final walk to Calvary. He walks himself, bearing his own cross. It should be noted that the condemned is to carry only the crossbeam of the cross. The uprights were already in position at the site of crucifixion. Once they arrive, the soldiers bind the condemned to the crossbeam with either ropes or nails, and then raise the crossbeam up, placing it on the upright. Finally, they affix the feet of the condemned to the upright with nails or rope. This entire process in John's Gospel is described succinctly as they crucified him. This is followed by a note that he was crucified with two others, one on either side of Jesus, with Jesus in the middle. This is the picture that we get from all of the evangelists. Here is a picture of Golgotha from the model of the city of Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. As you can see, it's a small hill outside of the walls of the city, which can be seen directly behind the hill. To the right in the wall is the Ganath Gate, which may suggest that Jesus passed through that gate as he exited the city. This is a mosaic found at the altar depicting the 11th station of the cross. Jesus is nailed to the cross, inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It shows Jesus being nailed to the cross, but also in the mosaic, one can see Abraham preparing or binding his son Isaac for sacrifice. The binding of Isaac in Jewish tradition has become a type of the crucifixion of Jesus. God did not ask Abraham any more than God himself was willing to do. At the site of the 12th station, Jesus dies on the cross, there's an altar in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If one looks under the altar, there's a picture of Jesus, in front of which is a round basin-like protrusion. In the center of that protrusion, the cross went to anchor it as it stood upright. Directly below this altar is what's called the Chapel of Adam. It's known in the Holy Sepulchre. It receives that name because tradition has it that Christ dies where Adam had been buried. Thus, Christ's blood would have fallen on Adam, and reconciled Adam and his descendants to God once and for all. Here is a map of the old city of Jerusalem. The Garden of Gethsemane is found on the right of the map toward the center. The house of Caiaphas, where the Jewish hearing took place, is in the lower left of the map. The fortress Antonia, where Pilate resided when he was in Jerusalem and the site of the Roman trial, is in the upper center of the map. And finally, the area of Golgotha, the site of the Crucifixion, is in the upper left of the map, just outside the walls. From the earliest time, the site of the death and resurrection of Jesus has been the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. However, in the late 19th century, an Englishman named Charles Gordon discovered a second site, which he proposed as Golgotha. It's located to the north of the walled city in the preceding map. Today, it's just outside the Damascus gate to the old city. It had a garden in which there was a tomb, as John's Gospel describes as the place of Jesus' burial. But even more striking, as seen in this picture, it shows what Gordon thought he recognized as a skull. Look to the center of the picture, and you can see the sockets for the eyes and an indentation for a nose. It does resemble a skull. Thus, as with many things in the Holy Land, we now have two sites for the death and resurrection of Jesus. But the major weight of authenticity falls on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is an example of what a titulus might have looked like. As you can see, the charge is written in the three significant languages of the region: Hebrew on the top, Latin in the middle, and Greek on the bottom. The text says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Returning to the text of John, then, we're told that Pilate had an inscription written to be placed on the cross. Usually this is known as a titulus, as I said, and it would bear the name of the condemned and some indication as to the crime for which he is being crucified. The inscription that Pilate ordered was, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. The inscription was then placed on the cross and seen by many, since the place of Golgotha was very near the entrance to the city. To ensure comprehension, Pilate had it inscribed in the three languages of the area: Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. One can see what such a titulus would look like at the bottom of this slide. Now, if we take the first letters of each of the words in the inscription, I from Iesus, or Jesus, N from Nazarenus, R from Rex, and I from Iodeorum, we get the inscription INRI that is found at the top of most crucifixes. It's a designation of who is being crucified and why, but to save space in crucifixes, it's abbreviated. Despite having achieved what they set out to do, that is, getting rid of Jesus, the chief priests and the Jewish leaders are still not happy. They do not like the way that the titulus is phrased. It states the reality that Jesus is the King of the Jews, which is precisely what the crucifixion is happening over. They would prefer it to say, rather, he said he was the King of the Jews. But Pilate will now have nothing more of their scheming, and declares definitively, "What I have written, I have written." When a person was crucified, it was customary that the soldiers carrying out the crucifixion would get the possessions of the crucified. Thus they took his garments and made 4 portions, one for each soldier. The outer garment, the tunic, however, was a single piece of cloth, woven from top to bottom without seam. And so to divide it would amount to destroying it. So they decided to cast lots for it. The author of the narrative then notes that this was to fulfill what was written in the 22nd Psalm, verse 19. "They parted my garments among them, and for my clothing or my vesture they cast lots." The focus now switches to those who are standing at the foot of the cross. They are specified as his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, and the beloved disciple. Note that only John specifies that those who were witnesses of the crucifixion were at the foot of the cross. The other evangelists put them at a distance. John realizes that his mother and the beloved disciple are there, and he gives his mother into the care of the beloved disciple with the words, "Woman, behold your son." Then to the beloved disciple he says, "Behold your mother." On the basis of this, many have debated the identity of his mother's sister. The simplest explanation would be that she was Mary, the mother of Clopas, the third name mentioned. But on the basis of Matthew's account, particularly Matthew 27:56, which mentions the mother of the sons of Zebedee, some have made the identification of his mother's sister with the mother of the sons of Zebedee. That would make James and John, the beloved disciple, first cousins of Jesus at that. Now, given the preponderance of evidence that the beloved disciple was John, the son of Zebedee, Jesus would then have given his mother into John's care. Being a first cousin, John would more than likely have been the nearest relative. Given all the circumstances, that is, that Joseph more than likely would have passed away, that Jesus had no siblings, then John would, in this scenario, be the nearest relative, in addition to being a trusted disciple. Thus, John took Mary into his own home from that point forward. The end was rapidly approaching. Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said again to fulfill the scriptures, "I thirst." The reference is to Psalm 69:21, which says, "They gave me vinegar for my thirst." Nearby was a bowl filled with vinegar, or possibly sour wine, used by the Roman soldiers. They took a sponge, soaked it in the vinegar, and raised it up to Jesus' lips via a piece of hyssop. Now, when he had received the vinegar, he simply said, "It is finished," bowed his head, and gave up the spirit. The death of Jesus is narrated succinctly and simply. As had been the case throughout the Passion narratives, Jesus is totally in charge, now choosing the very moment of his death. The Greek does not contain the pronominal adjective his, modifying spirit, but rather says he handed over the Spirit. At the point of Jesus' death, he hands over the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, which will then be received by the apostles during the appearance in the upper room on the following Sunday evening. Jesus' death sets in motion a number of things. It is the day of preparation. In normal time, it was preparation for the Sabbath. But this particular day was a special one. It was not only preparation for the Sabbath, but also for the great feast of Passover. Hence, there was great urgency for the bodies to be removed from the crosses. The other two crucified with Jesus did not seem to be dying as quickly as Jesus. So the Jews requested that Pilate break the legs of the crucified, that they be broken to hasten the process. Pilate acceded to the soldiers' request, breaking their legs, to inhibit the process of breathing, which for one being crucified involved using the legs to push the body up to take air. When they came to Jesus, they discovered that he was already dead. One of the soldiers pierced the side of Jesus with a lance or a spear, and at once blood and water poured out. Doctors have surmised that this was a piercing of the pericardial sac, which produced the blood and water combination. On a further level, to counter those who would say that the crucifixion was not real, the blood and the water show that this is a real person really being crucified. Then follows a statement concerning the veracity of the account that is being given here. These things are true, and are told that the readers and the hearers may now come to believe. Then the author sees these events as fulfilling two further scripture texts, one from the Psalms and the other from the prophet Zechariah. The Psalms text is 34:20. He keeps all of his bones, not one of them is broken. This makes reference to the fact that Jesus' bones were not broken. Also, it alludes to the qualifications of the Paschal Lamb, which was to have no broken bones. The second text is Zechariah 12:10, which also makes reference to Jesus. They will look upon the one whom they have pierced. Rabbinic Messianic interpretation took this text to mean that the Messiah would be pierced, and people would look to God. Thus, John, citing this Zechariah text here, sees further confirmation that Jesus, who was crucified, is indeed the Messiah. Kostenberger notes that the suffering servant of 2nd Isaiah may have been in the mind of the author. Also, Isaiah 55:10 notes that he was pierced for our transgressions, as Jesus here crucified stands pierced for our transgressions. The burial of Jesus is then narrated. Joseph of Arimathea, a secret disciple of Jesus, comes out of his secrecy and requests the body of Jesus from Pilate. Pilate gives him leave to take the body. Then Nicodemus, whom we saw in the 3rd chapter of the Gospel and again in the 7th chapter, makes his final appearance, bringing spices necessary for burial, myrrh and aloes weighing about 100 pounds. Joseph and Nicodemus, presumably with the assistance of the women, take the body of Jesus, bind it with the burial cloths, and place the burial spices according to the customs of the Jews. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden there was a tomb where no one had ever been laid. This is the verse from John's account that gave rise to in the later 19th century to the tradition of the garden tomb in Jerusalem that we spoke about earlier. Gordon, a British commander in the Middle East, discovered what he thought was the area known as Golgotha, because of the imprint of a skull thought to be in a rock, and nearby a garden which held a tomb. However, The preponderance of evidence for the actual burial place of Jesus still remains with the Holy Sepulchre. Now, because of the urgency of the impending festival, they laid Jesus' body in that tomb and closed up the tomb, departing quietly. What would the tomb of Jesus look like? This is the picture of a rock-cut tomb located in the sublevel of the convent of the Sisters of Nazareth in Nazareth. As you can see, the tomb is cut into the rock with a rather large round stone in front of the entrance. In this particular photo, the rock enclosing the tomb is in its open position. With some difficulty, it can be rolled to the left and thus cover the entrance of the tomb as seen in this picture. This is the picture of a model of the tomb which is used at the Holy Sepulchre to explain burial in those days. Here we see the model with the enclosing rock in the closed position. It can then be rolled to the open position near the thumb of the hand holding the model. The model can then be opened to show the interior of the tomb, what it would be like. There are two chambers, designated by the arrows. The innermost chamber is where the body is placed, usually on a slab of concrete or marble, designated by the green circle. The second chamber is just inside the entrance, for mourners to gather and pray, or weep, or just be with the deceased. The Holy Sepulchre, as it exists today, has those two chambers. This is a picture of the edicule, as it's known. Just inside the entrance is the mourner's chamber, and beyond that chamber, the one where the body is laid. When Mass is celebrated in the Holy Sepulchre, the liturgy of the Word takes place in the mourner's chamber, as we see here. And the liturgy of the Eucharist is inside the second chamber, using the platform on which the body would be placed as an altar. Finally, this is a picture of the garden tomb as it exists today. As you can see, the tomb is cut into the rock of the background. There is a track in front of the tomb for the rolling stone. Here we have a picture of a rolling stone. Its diameter would be just slightly larger than the height of the entrance to the tomb. Its width would match the width of the track, which is pictured here. One can see that the size would be quite large, and the corresponding weight would be rather heavy. One can see how the comment in Mark's Gospel that the stone was a huge one would be quite accurate. As we move to the 20th chapter of John's Gospel, we have the Johannine version of the empty tomb narrative. The time is given as the first day of the week. The Greek, however, translates this as day 1 of the week. We then meet Mary Magdalene, who is on her way to the tomb early, that is, while it is still dark. When she arrives, to her great surprise, the stone has been taken away, that is, rolled back from the tomb. This signals that she should not approach alone. So she runs to tell the apostles, especially Peter and the beloved disciple, what she presumes she has discovered, that the body of the Lord has been stolen from the tomb, with the corresponding crisis that they now don't know where it is. Note, Mary, in her assessment of the situation, had no thought of resurrection. As a result of Mary's report, Peter and the beloved disciple, head toward the tomb. The author tells us that they're running, and the other disciple gets to the tomb first. He assesses the situation, stooping to peer into the tomb, where he sees the linen burial cloths lying there. However, he does not enter the tomb. Peter finally arrives at the tomb and enters. He sees the exact same thing as the beloved disciple, but also now sees the cloth that was used for the face, not with the rest, but rolled up in a place by itself. Some scholars, for example Kostenberger, surmise that Peter's delay may be due to the fact that he's older than the beloved disciple and hence not able to move as fast. Finally, the beloved disciple, or the other disciple, enters the tomb. We're told that he saw, and that was all that was necessary for him. He believed. The fact that the cloths remained in the tomb leads one to surmise that the body of Jesus had somehow passed through the cloths, causing them to drop to the ground. Kostenberger notes, the expression folded up may actually mean rolled up, which either points to neatness or that the cloth was still in the exact same position as when Jesus had been wrapped in it, or both. Then, an editorial comment that they did not as yet know the scripture pertaining to the fact that Jesus must rise from the dead. The scene then switches abruptly to Mary Magdalene, who now stands weeping outside the tomb. In the midst of her tears, she stoops down to look into the tomb. What she sees is quite different to what the two disciples saw. She does not see burial cloths, rather she sees two angels sitting where the body of Jesus once was, one at the head and one at the foot. They question why she's weeping, and she explains to them what she presumes has taken place. That is, that the body of Jesus has been stolen, and now she does not know where it is. But then, in a simple action of turning, the narrative of the empty tomb becomes a narrative of an appearance of the risen Lord to Mary, even though she doesn't realize it at first. She turns and sees a man who, for the readers, is identified as Jesus standing there. Mary, however, does not know who it is, seeing only the outline of a man through her tears. He asks her the exact same question as the angels in the tomb. Why is she weeping? But adds the question asked of the disciples of John the Baptist at the beginning of the gospel, and the question asked of the arrest party at the beginning of the Passion narrative. Who or what do you seek? Now we're told what she's thinking. Supposing him to be the gardener, who might have some information on the whereabouts of Jesus' body, she responds, Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away. Jesus answers Mary's entreaty with a simple word, Mary. She recognizes his voice and realizes that he is not the gardener, but he is the Lord himself. So she turns and addresses him as teacher, Rabboni in Hebrew. This is a verification of Jesus' example in the Good Shepherd, chapter 10, verse 3. Then Jesus commands Mary not to touch him. The Greek verb used there, haptomai, has the sense of cling or hold on to. Why should she not touch him? Because he has not yet ascended to the Father. He has to ascend, so he cannot be held on to. Rather, She is to go and tell the good news that he's risen. He's ascending to his Father and their Father, to his God and their God. The use of me, my, and your in this statement signifies that as a result of the Paschal mystery, there are now two forms of filiation, that is, being children of God. One depicts Jesus' relationship to God as Father. The other depicts our relationship to God as Father. Mary then does what Jesus asks. She goes and announces to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and then describes the encounter to them. We now move to the evening of that first day of the week. The Greek, again, is telling. Rather than the normal word for first, protos, the Greek uses the word for one, hais, the feminine of which is mia. In other words, it says on day one of the week. This is a direct allusion to the opening of the book of Genesis, which referred to the days of creation as day one, day two, etc. Hence, John has Jesus rising in the darkness and now in the daylight appearing to Mary and Mary Magdalene and the apostles. The doors of the upper room where they were are staying locked. They still fear that the Jewish leaders may be out to get them now that they've eliminated Jesus. But that's no deterrent for the risen Lord. He comes now and he stands among them, offering the standard Jewish greeting of Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you. Then, to verify that it really is him, he shows them his hands and his side. This elicits a response of sheer joy from the disciples, realizing that the person standing before them was indeed their own master, alive and not dead. Jesus then repeats the greeting, "Peace be with you." Then he gives them the commission, transferring the mission that had been entrusted to him to them. "As the Father has sent me, so also do I send you." Jesus' part in the mission has come to a conclusion, but the mission continues now in the capable hands of the disciples. In the principles that govern sending and agency, the fifth principle is that an agent can appoint further agents to continue his mission. This is precisely what Jesus is doing here. As Beasley Murray notes, the time has now come for the disciples to go forth into the world as the representatives of the Lord. Thus, Jesus sends the apostles out to continue his mission. Further, he breathes on them, a sign of enlivening. Remember that God breathed life into Adam at the beginning. In the vision of the dry bones in Ezekiel 37, once the army had been rebuilt as men, God breathed the spirit of life into them, and they became living beings. Recall that in the death scene, at the moment of his death, Jesus handed over the Spirit. Now the apostles, as they're commissioned, receive that same Spirit, who will be a guide and a life force to them in carrying out that mission. Then we see the Johannine form of the bestowal of the form of forgiving. Jesus continues, "If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." This is the same as the power of binding and loosing given to Peter in the Matthean narrative of chapter 16 in Matthew's Gospel. Note that it was the leadership, the rabbis, who had this power in Judaism. Now that power will be held by the Christian community, and in particular its leaders, the apostles. Maloney reminds us that we must understand this forgiveness or this retention in light of the movement of the entire gospel. Jesus has offered the possibility of relationship with God to many in the gospel. We've seen that some have accepted it and came to the light. We've seen others reject it, refusing to let the light shine on them. Maloney says, a further connection must be made with the Johannine understanding of the response to the revelation of God in and through Jesus. Some come to the light, but some turn away, and the wrath of God rests upon them. Attention now turns to the one of the apostles who was not present at the time of the first appearance, Thomas, who's described as one of the 12, called Didymus, which means twin. He's contrasted to the disciples who were present through the use of the Greek particle de. This further highlights Thomas's absence when Jesus came. Now, as a result, the other disciples tell him, "We've seen the Lord." Again, introducing Thomas's reaction to that with the Greek particle de, Thomas says, "Unless I see the print of the nails and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand in his side, I will not believe." The double negative used there, oume, serves in Greek not to reverse, but rather to emphasize the negative. Unless there is no way on earth that I'm going to believe, he says. Again, the verb that is used here is much stronger than place. It connotes throw. Thus, unless I thrust my finger or my hand into his hand or into his side, is what Thomas is really saying. What Thomas is doing here is rigorously applying the categories of Jewish thought concerning the resurrection of the dead. There must be a strict continuity between the two worlds. The scene then shifts to 8 days later. We're told that the disciples were again inside, and this time Thomas was with them. Again, as has been narrated at 20:19, the doors were shut, that is locked, and Jesus still came and stood among them, offering the now familiar greeting, "Peace be with you." He then turns to Thomas and tells him to put his finger and see the wounds in his hands, and to put out his hand and thrust it into the wound at his side, exactly what Thomas said would have to happen for him to believe. This is to bring Thomas from the state of unbelief or faithlessness to faith, to belief. We are not told whether Thomas actually does what Jesus commands, or simply makes an act of faith. My Lord and my God, on the basis of what he has just experienced. Beasley Murray notes that verse 29 will speak of Thomas merely seeing. There's not a mention of actually touching or placing his hand in the side. Then Jesus responds to Thomas's act of faith. Is it on behalf or on the basis of what he has just experienced or seen that he believes? That, as we shall see, is still an inadequate faith. Jesus then gives the criteria for adequate faith in John's Gospel. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. This certainly will bolster the faith of those who are hearing or reading John's Gospel. It is the faith without empirical evidence that's ultimately faith for John. Nevertheless, as Schnackenberg points out, With Thomas's confession, the theme of doubt is over. The final two verses of this chapter seem to be a conclusion to the gospel as a whole. Joined with the connective therefore, the author notes, on the one hand, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. This, on the basis of what precedes, is seen by Kostenberger as a note of value to the signs that Jesus has performed. But, on the other hand, the signs that have been written or narrated in the content of the gospel have been chosen with a very specific purpose: to lead the reader or the hearer to belief. That is, allow the reader or the hearer of the gospel to see through the signs and let it point to the reality that Jesus, the main personage of the gospel, is the Christ, the Son of God, and that through that belief they will come to have life, that is, eternal life. We thus have a succinct compendium of the whole gospel here. The author, J. Blank, writes, "This is the shortest summary of Johannine theology. If one wished to explain every concept of this concluding remark in its full significance, one would have to read through the entire gospel again, and yet again, and yet again." Well, we are a bit over time, but we had to get to the end of that chapter. Next time, we'll look at the epilogue of the Gospel of John as it's found in chapter 21. See you then.